The opposition movement, which has united the nation across sectarian lines, is calling for an overhaul of a political system that it considers corrupt. And as ever, the media is playing a significant role. For more, I'd like to cross to Beirut, where Kareem Chehayeb is standing by. He's an independent journalist and human rights researcher. Kareem, thank you so much for being with us. Can you tell us about the role of the mainstream media, which protesters believe has been complicit because, of course, inside the country, the majority of the outlets are controlled by political donors?
Thank you for having me. Absolutely. So Lebanon has a very diverse media landscape, but most of the ownership goes into political parties, politicians, businessmen with political ambitions. So as a result, they are trying to control the narrative or fit the narrative in their own way. The interesting thing is that there are some channels that like to side with the protesters as much as possible to appear as reformists, to appeal to a new generation which is sick of this political class. But there are others who are affiliated with political parties as well that are trying to demonize some aspects of the protests or trying to show a certain light of the protests rather than others.
Kareem, you just mentioned there are, of course, attempts in the country to control the narrative, and falling in line with that, there have been reports of the dismissal of an editor who works for the country's official news agency. Perhaps signs of increasing media repression?
Perhaps. There are certainly laws in Lebanon's penal code, particularly defamation and slander laws, which have been used to silence not just activists but journalists as well, who are just doing their job investigating allegations of corruption and other forms of abuse in the country. It does seem that there has been a greater trend of the use of these libel and defamation laws in the penal code to scare journalists and activists more than ever before over the past year. Some organizations like the Samir Asir Foundation, which monitors press freedom rights in various countries in the region, have noticed an alarming trend here in Lebanon. But apart from the state itself, because the political parties in Lebanon have these informal groups, some armed, there's informal ways of repressing and intimidating journalists as well. As we have seen in protests, not these in particular, but ones before, journalists have not been spared when it comes to police and military violence as well, especially if they're taking pictures of what could be police brutality.
And of course, they're not just intimidating journalists, are there? There are reports that protesters, activists are receiving WhatsApp, social media messages in a bid to be deterred from taking to the streets.
Yes, absolutely. So I haven't heard much about this happening in Beirut in particular, but there has been word about the protests that are taking place in other cities around the country, Tripoli in the south and the in particular, where people have received messages saying, don't go out on the streets, people are going to get hurt. And there have been a few incidents of violence from armed groups affiliated with a political party or the bodyguards of a former MP where shootings have taken place in Tripoli and in Sur. So this has already scared people. So this sort of adds fuel to the fire. At the same time, there is some social media harassment, which could be some sort of electronic army or bot army, but that's still early stages to kind of verify that at this point. But Mark Owen Jones, who's sort of specialized with that, has revealed that there has been a surge of social media accounts that have been pushing a pro-Hezbollah narrative, particularly during the period of the rise of the protests. So we could be seeing something similar happening with other parties as well, if this is the case.
Can you tell us a little bit more about these disinformation campaigns on social media to drive the debate?
On the ground itself, there's lots of people who are very critical of Hezbollah, but claim that Hassan Nasrallah is an exception because they see him as more of a social and religious figure rather than a political leader. And some people see Hezbollah as a complete exception. Following Hassan Nasrallah's speech, there were some chants against him in Beirut saying that, he is one of the elite. And when we talk about the fall of the government or the regime, he is one of them. Whereas suddenly an emerging hashtag to kind of counter that narrative online says, basically says something along the lines of, we trust Hezbollah, or Hezbollah has our trust. And we sort of saw this social media war to see, which sort of trend gets the most attention online. And there have been some attempts to kind of give this uprising a bit of a pro-Hezbollah spin on it, which is sort of ironic given that, you have the main demands are that people want the government to resign and they want to complete a new government, whereas Hezbollah wants it to stay. So it's sort of an interesting thing to kind of shape a discourse. And there's also a fear of Hezbollah. Even though Hezbollah doesn't necessarily use their arms on the ground in Lebanon among Lebanese citizens, there's a fear considering that they have a pretty powerful armed wing, and which has not only battled militaries like Israel, but has played a significant role in the battlefield in Syria. So this causes fear and scares people from entering the square to protest.
Many different forces there in Lebanon trying to drive that debate as those protests continue across the country. Kareem Chehayeb, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us here on Middle East
Thank you for having me.
Matters.